Good afternoon. My name is Holly Parker, and I'm the new Active Transportation Lead for SLR Consulting, formerly known as Milan and McBroom. And I'd like to begin today's presentation by our panel of thought leaders in energy, policy, and transportation by thanking the Transport Hartford Academy at the Center for Latino Progress for convening this annual summit, which we started planning in the late spring. I've had the great privilege of working with some of the most forward-thinking decision makers in the region on pedestrian and bicycle safety and on public bicycle and electric scooter fleets, which you'll hear referred to in this conversation as micro-mobility. Over the past year, Carolyn Lush and I have been working with the city of New Haven on curbside electric car charging and electric car sharing. We've been pushing a boulder uphill as we've tried to understand the logistics, policy, and funding required to provide adequately ubiquitous charging and parking facilities, as well as how to share our streets safely while introducing additional transportation modes so that they're operationally and financially sustainable. And when we talk about electric vehicles, most people think about converting gas-powered cars to electric ones. There are, however, 2 electric bicycles sold for every electric car in the United States, and demand for electric bikes, scooters, mopeds, and one-wheelers continues to rise. And just swapping out our gas cars for electric ones is also not going to solve traffic congestion as long as there continues to be only one person in each vehicle. Broadly, multimodal transportation means that constellation of all vehicles on our roads, trails, and bike paths that transport us for part of our trip. In my case, my commute is multimodal because the bike mode takes me to the train mode. Electric vehicles are today's topic, though, because of the climate imperative to shift away from gas-powered vehicles, and because of electric vehicles' popularity and ability to move us further and faster than our feet and conventional bicycles. What do we need to do to transition more of our trips to electric vehicle trips? How will we get enough people to make the switch to electric to make a meaningful dent in the current vehicle mix? The lineup for this supercharged discussion will begin with Paul Mondesire and wrap up with Senator Will Haskell and Marissa Gillett, who will provide some thoughts about how state policies can support shared electric bikes and scooters, as well as passenger and transit vehicles. And with that context, let me introduce our esteemed panelists. Affectionately known as Tall Paul, Paul Mondesire's skills and experiences are longer than my arm, but include development, communications, and strategic visioning. He made the transition into the nascent micromobility sector, leveraging his experience in the media, the nonprofit sector, and community relations. Paul now improves communities one well-trained scooter rider at a time in his current role as Superperpedestrian's head of policy and community engagement. Paul Vosper, the CEO of Juice Bar, is a former public defender whose company provides not only electric vehicle charging stations, but well-paying jobs in Connecticut. Creighton Randall has worked in shared mobility his whole career, having been involved in it since the earliest days of car share and bike share in Buffalo, New York. He's now focused primarily on EV car share. And we're lucky that he now calls Connecticut home and expect to see the impacts of his local presence soon. Marissa Gillett is the chair of Connecticut's Public Utility Regulatory Authority. We sparked a friendship right away when she expressed a desire to understand the micromobility industry. You're going to see that as a familiar theme among all of today's panelists. They are willing to step outside of their areas of specific expertise to gain a deeper understanding of the technology, culture, funding mechanisms, and policy that will steer us toward a cleaner and more equitable transportation system. Senator Will Haskell has been a Connecticut state senator for 3 years. He's co-chair of the Transportation Committee, vice chair of the Government Administration and Elections Committee, and is a member of the Judiciary and Environment Committees. So I'm not sure when he sleeps, but he and Pura Chair Gillett have made time for us today to get some concrete policy ideas to bring to our state leadership. So please share your thoughts in the chat as we listen to our speakers and give them all a round of virtual applause. Tall Paul, can you please get us started?
Thank you so much, Holly. Can folks hear me? That's the first question. Excellent. Well, first, thank you, Holly, and good afternoon. Thank you to the kind folks at the Center for Latino Progress and Transport Hartford for all of their efforts and for their hospitality in hosting this important virtual event. That's the last slide, so I hope I'm not wrapping it up just yet.
Whoops. Apologies.
That's okay. I was like, oh, wow, that was quick. Okay. Please forgive me. You can probably tell that's not Hartford. Just to start off with, a little bit more seriously, Superperpedestrian is one of the companies that vied to become part of the New York pilot, but we are not, I repeat, are not part of the New York pilot. That was a little bit disappointing, but it allowed us to do expansion into another 49 plus cities around the world. So it's kind of okay, but we'll talk about that later. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Superperpedestrian, the company. We are a company that was founded out of the Sensible Cities Lab at MIT. We have over 40 patents in our portfolio. Safety is first, second, and third for us. We are 100% carbon neutral, which you can read. And one of the things that I think is most important here is that Superperpedestrian is a company that is really focused on providing real solutions in real time that are sustainable. We do this through both our technology as well as a really thoughtful approach to operations and the whole rest of what it goes into to run in this industry. Next slide, please. So the company briefly was founded in 2013. The vehicle intelligence system that is at the core of our current scooter was originally part of the Copenhagen wheel, which was a self-contained unit that converted a standard bike into an electric bike. You might have seen that big red disc on the back of a few folks' rides over the course of the years. So that's kind of where we got started. Now in 2019, really coinciding with the big push in e-scooters, our engineers made a decision that they were going to actively pursue creating the best e-scooter in the market. I believe that we have done this. And to prove it, when I started in February, we were in under 20 cities. We are now in 50 plus cities around the world, 8 countries and counting, just getting ready to launch in Turkey. We got a lot of things going on. But with that, I want to shift on. So who is this guy? So I'm Tall Paul. It may be hard to tell from this tiny rectangle on your screen, but I earned this nickname through genetics. I spent almost 20 years in the television business doing everything except make lots of money. I shifted into the nonprofit world, as was mentioned before, doing development work and communications that was focused on social justice and education primarily. Then I found myself in the unique position of being in the nascent and growing micromobility field. It has been a wild ride, and it has been a lot of fun. So next slide, please. So how do we get around in our dreams? There are thousands of hours of car commercials. This is not from a car commercial. This is from the streets of Dumbo, not too far from where I live. This gentleman right here had just got himself this new car. He had a professional photographer come out to shoot him, and I got a better shot than those guys. But the key element that I'm mentioning this about, the reason I am mentioning this, please forgive me, is that the auto industry has been around for 100 years. It has a tremendous influence on our economy, on the way we get around, and just about anything else you can think of, considering the number of industries that are involved in both making cars, manufacturing them, servicing them, marketing them, the list goes on. So I will also say, yeah, I'm a car nut, so which is kind of apparent here, but there are real costs to the world's devotion to cars as primary individual transportation. Next slide, please. Yes. You see, now, how do they get around in our nightmares? I also saw this vehicle on the streets of downtown Brooklyn, and that kind of freaked me out because not only is that a Hummer, but that's a Hummer with 3 axles in the back, for God's sake. And it's a limo. What the heck do we need that vehicle to exist in my time-space continuum for? No, this is bad, especially when you see you got 2 guys on mopeds, one with, both without helmets. Sorry, that's bad. But the real point is this. We're at a point where we really cannot afford to have all of these. Yeah, that is correct. Double-decker Hummer. Can you imagine? The fact of the matter is the general population has been sold that bigger is always better. This has certainly been the case in the car industry. And the reason that SUVs are ubiquitous is because of tax laws, combination of tax laws, the white Bronco from O.J. Simpson days, and America's obsession with bigger is better. Now, I could go on, but there's more important things to talk about, like solutions. So please forgive. Next slide, please. And here we are. So what is micromobility exactly? Well, for this discussion, our friends at the New York City Department of Transportation have developed this chart. Notice I did not say helpful chart. Why? Now it's pretty cool because you have e-bikes of various classifications, mopeds of various classifications, e-scooters, right? Everything's defined, except there are several vehicles that are on the road right now that are just deemed illegal, according to the DOT. Now they're in private hands, but that also means what? That means that if they're deemed illegal, that means that there has to be some kind of enforcement mechanism. That enforcement mechanism is adding a burden to who? Local law enforcement, as well as our local lawmakers who have to figure out how to regulate these things rather than just saying that they're illegal, because this is a very nuanced set of challenges and we really have to deal with this. I didn't want to go off on a tangent, so please forgive. I will say this. Local police are being asked to enforce new rules while simultaneously being told to reduce traffic stop interactions to decrease friction with an already edgy public at large. Please forgive me from reading directly from my notes, but I wanted to make sure I said that correctly. We live in these times. This is not the before times. Everybody is on edge, as we know. That makes our shared streets all the more dangerous. I don't want to get too far off on the tangent there, but I want to acknowledge this as being important. Next slide, please. So, sorry. With that, micromobility is doing some things that are extraordinary. And I think that one of the things that is important about it in the context of Hartford, and I'm going to talk about Hartford specifically because our hosts have really been a tremendous set of allies in this work. That means, not only the folks of the, excuse me, I got a little bit tangled up because I'm looking at my notes. Bottom line is that everyone in Hartford, including the city government and everybody in between, community-based organizations, et cetera, have been remarkable. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that we were very, very serious about engaging with the public at large. We engaged with 12 local organizations, along with law enforcement and of course other stakeholders, including the police and the mayor's office, et cetera, the Department of Transportation. We were very serious about engaging all of these folks. We also are very serious about hiring locally. These are the things that really, really do make a difference for us on the ground. We say that presence matters, of course, in a COVID-safe environment, of course, but we did level up safety trainings. We are consistent not only in our launch patterns, but also consistent in maintaining our relationships. Why? Because the fact of the matter is, in order for micromobility to become sustainable, we have to move from being a novelty to being a utility. We have to make it so that everybody looks at this as, yes, this is the way that I want to get to and from work. And I can also point out that in Hartford in particular, we have our Link Up program, which offers a 70% discount for qualifying participants. And we've had almost 400 folks sign up to date. Why is this important? Well, we have found that there's a very significant percentage of our riders who are of limited means. And that also means that they're riding scooters instead of getting into cars. I can get into a little bit more detail later on, but this is a really, really important element for decreasing pressure on the infrastructure. I am mindful for time, so let me pick up the pace. Next slide, please. So what can micromobility bring to our cities? I think that Superpedestrian, first of all, local hiring and training is extraordinarily important because you have to have people on the ground who understand what it's like on the ground. Two of the images that you have here on the page are from Baltimore. One rather obviously. The other one is from Asbury Park, New Jersey. In both cases, we hire locally and we hire only W-2 workers. There are no gig or agency labor in our company. And we always provide ongoing education and advancement opportunities. In particular, we can talk about Superpedestrian University, which is our internal training program. We are very mindful about having strategic and equitable operations. What does that mean? You know, we have these innovative transportation technologies that we leverage to serve underserved communities. This is something that oftentimes is overlooked in the models that some of the other operators in this sector utilize in their business models. Listen, that we can't speak to that. We can speak to what we do. And that's really what's important in this context. So for example, we do have local programs. So for example, LinkServe offers a 30% discount to 240,000 veterans and 111,000 active military folks in San Diego. Why are we offering these benefits like that? Because these folks are working very hard for the country. We also, again, we offer our link up program for people that are living in these challenging times. This stuff is important because the fact of the matter is that we are trying to facilitate weaving ourselves into the fabric of the transportation systems. And one of the ways that you do that is by helping people that need the help when they need it. Map of the scooter drop spots in most. I can share a little more detail with that later on if you'd be so kind. Next slide, please. So what are folks doing on our scooters? Well, the fact of the matter is that they're doing everything. I mean, and it's really kind of wild. I mean, I was, quite frankly, I was a little bit skeptical at first because I'm a bike rider and a car guy. And I was like, oh, these scooters, but they're really, really easy to get around. And they can really provide legitimate solutions for people on the ground. So for example, based on local survey data and national averages, Link scooters have replaced 60,000 car trips in Hartford this year. And many of those would have been Uber Lyfts. And so that means that there are folks that are on the ground in Hartford that are saving real money, because the difference between a scooter ride and an Uber Lyft is going to be, well, let's just say significant. We can go into more detail later on. Also, we are a legitimate first and last mile solution. What are people doing? People are running local errands. We're supporting local businesses in these trying times because they're shopping locally. These things are really, 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 really important. Okay, wants and needs and sustainability. So we need a better, more inclusive infrastructure. This is critical, and that is a serious policy issue. New riders, not just early adopters. This is when I talk about we need to be able to prove our value proposition so that we move from being a novelty to a utility. That's exactly what I'm talking about. In order to do that, we need strong city partnerships. We need to improve our driver and rider education. This is critical. And I say driver education first because, quite frankly, the drivers are in control of vehicles that can do very serious damage. We know this from our society. I don't need to cite very specific cases, but everybody's seen the news, right? So this is not a joke. We are quite serious about this. We need a nuanced discussion of how to better manage our shared streets. I am tall Paul Mondesire. I am stating this very clearly. We need a nuanced conversation about how to share our streets better. Next slide, please. Now, real brief, case in point in Asbury Park, we have this mapped out as challenges and opportunities. The challenge was creating a culture of safe riding, especially with the tourists. So we worked with local resources. We trained local crossing guards to become safety ambassadors. We worked with the Asbury Park Complete Streets and Second Life bikes to have materials dispersed and to engage locals as well as visitors. And we had a lot of direct engagement. I did trainings myself down there. It was wonderful. Keeping pedestrians and riders safe. So parking placement is critical everywhere. Any market that you're talking about, you have to figure out how you're going to manage your parking. In Asbury Park, we used parking corrals that are, we use our very, very accurate geofencing to create preferred parking zones, basically. And you can see that image there, that is one of them. There are many reasons for this. The main one is that it helps to keep the city happy and people safe. Last, we are very, very serious about keeping underage riders off of our scooters. This is not a joke. We understand that they're easy to ride. That's not the point. They are serious motor vehicles and we want people to be safe. We also are very serious about double riding. I have personally seen to it that folks are suspended from their accounts if they're double riding, particularly with children. Why? Because it's really dangerous. Next slide, please. So in wrapping things up, so micromobility is a toddler. Why do I say this? I have a 4.5-year-old daughter. Lime, the company, the behemoth, is exactly 3 weeks older than my daughter. She was born on St. Patrick's Day of 2017, and Lime was born on February 23rd of that same year. That means that patience is a virtue. Technology is a tool and not a crutch. We have to figure this stuff out. I keep talking about nuanced conversations because that's what is required. It is also critical for the sector to listen to local stakeholders so that people can know that they are being better served. Folks, thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. That is Paul Mondesire, Tall Paul, that's me. Paul.mondesire@superpedestrian.com, and I hope I got out in a reasonable amount of time.
Thanks, Paul. I didn't really anticipate that it would be under 10 minutes because you have so much to share. But really appreciate that presentation that was as entertaining as it was informative. And I'm going to stop sharing now so that Creighton can participate and share his screen.
Hey guys, can everybody hear me all right? All right. Thank you, Paul. I have a lot of agreement with a lot of what you said here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Give me 1 second. All right. All right. So I'll do my best to keep it to 10 minutes or less, but I also can be a little bit long, but I'll do my best. So yeah, so Creighton Randall with mobility development, probably a name you haven't heard. We tend to be sort of in the background. I'll talk a little bit about what we do, focus a little bit more on the sort of EV car share side of things, although I will mention our work in the e-bike world, and share a little bit about sort of where these programs come together in terms of state level investment in particular. So our organization exists to support the growth of community controlled electric vehicle mobility networks. So by that, I mean, we are kind of the behind the scenes actor that helps to set programs up, often in places that they wouldn't otherwise exist or that the market might not ordinarily serve. That tends to be small and mid-sized cities in particular, as well as in rural parts of the country. And so most of our emphasis, as Holly mentioned, is in the car sharing space, although we do some work in e-bike sharing and with e-bike libraries, as well as in volunteer transportation. So we find that, you know, I often say we don't do pilots, right? We tend to look beyond sort of the 2-year time scale into what's it going to take to, say, have a program that's going to succeed in the long term in a place like Hartford or New Haven. So we look towards not nonprofit ownership structures, public ownership structures often, longer term public contracts. Those allow us to kind of make the prioritization that Paul mentioned earlier, really focus on marginalized communities. So right now, our work has followed where you see climate investments. So that's primarily New York and California. We are on the cusp of, it's a little bit too soon for me to announce a kind of ambitious expansion from the 5 states where we currently operate to about 12, going into the sort of the tail end of next year. These programs are slow to launch, right? Because they're often supported by public sector grant programs, which will take their time to kind of develop out. So what do I mean by car sharing, right? Most of you, I would think, are familiar with Zipcar or Car2Go or maybe Get Around or Turo. Well, the basics, the technology basics are pretty much the same, right? Folks use car sharing for trips to the grocery store, doctor's appointment, job interview. Often these are short-term trips. They're structured in terms of electric vehicles, particularly in programs that primarily serve for disadvantaged communities or marginalized communities, a little bit different. Pricing is lower in general. That shouldn't be a huge surprise. So Los Angeles is probably the best example of a program. We don't run this one ourselves. We support the city's contract with a private operator called Blink, which many of you may be familiar with as a charging operator as well. So the price is discounted, oftentimes discounted across the board. Sometimes in a case like Los Angeles, it's
Lost his audio.
although there are stations, so public charging stations on street throughout Los Angeles. This program in particular is the largest in North America, with electric vehicles and expanding to about 300 cars and 500 charge points over the next couple of years. A smaller, more rural program. Some of you may have colleagues that are on the other session today that's kind of going into detail on this, so I won't spend too much time on this, but MioCar is a rural version of EV car sharing, the only one in the country, and serves smaller cities, some towns. Primarily, these are farm worker communities in the San Joaquin Valley and Central California. Priced even lower, right? So $4 an hour, $35 a day. Given that this is a more rural setting, we tend to see longer term trips, several hours a day, 2-3 days, even 5 days in some cases. This is really taking off, I think, in part, frankly, because of the way the state of California has chosen to make investments in these systems, which I'll get into a little bit later. But California's really kind of ramped up their climate investments to make sure that these programs can serve all parts of the state, really. A little bit closer to home, I'll talk a little bit about FlowShare, which is our program in Rochester, New York. So Rochester, not too different of a city in some ways than a Hartford or New Haven. Rochester is about 150,000 people. And this is a program supported directly by the city. So the city is essentially the client. City intends to see, like in MioCar in California, a sort of a nonprofit home for the program long term. So we're on a sort of a 5-year trajectory towards. And like MioCar, just baseline $5 an hour. We don't actually screen for income, right? Because we know from every program we've run so far that these are primarily serving disadvantaged communities, low-income households, that it makes more sense to just set a flat rate. And this is really a lot like transit, right? So you're seeing a pricing model that kind of reflects the way people think about transit. In Rochester, not too different than Connecticut, or I should say upstate New York, not too different than Connecticut. A lot of room to
We lost you.
car share car, you might want four chargers.
Audio dropped again.
Yep, Creighton, your sound is going in and out. You're a little glitchy.
I'm sure you'll hear from Paul. They're moving that along. And you know, in Rochester, you're seeing maybe a 12, 15 car program is what that build out looks like. And I'll just speak a little bit about our e-bike library initiative, which is not too different, kind of coming out of electric vehicle, coming out of bike sharing and kind of moving into e-bikes. And this is an initiative that came out of Uber getting out of the market and sort of moving to Lime that Paul mentioned earlier, and really looking to donate those vehicles to the kind of models that we serve around the country. So if you're curious about that, you can reach out to me afterwards. I just want to briefly investment. Often that's coming from a state energy agency like California Air Resources Board or NYSERDA in New York or MassCC in California, in Massachusetts. But the more that state DOTs, local transit agencies, cities get involved, take on ownership of this program. Albany, New York, we're seeing CDTA, the transit agency, really literally take ownership over the program. The program is branded Drive CDTA. But energy regulators and utilities are equally important. Can't do this without the utilities. Eversource in particular, really critical component to making programs work in New England. At the end of the day, sometimes it just takes a lot of sort of pushing to get that infrastructure in place, and maybe going above and beyond. So not to get any one public sector official in trouble, but this stencil in Boston for the program there, you'd be good to go. You know, sometimes it takes a really committed public servant to go in and stencil the parking space themselves. If maybe the regulatory environment makes that take 2 months longer. So it helps for us to have really eager, you know, public champions of these programs. And lastly, like I said earlier, right, we shy away from the term pilot. We shy away from the term turnkey. You know, as Paul mentioned, these are not simple things. These are nuanced, right? And you need that sort of willingness to kind of take this beyond just a pilot program. And to use a double entendre, I think, you know, you need political leadership as well. So you'll hear from another bit of willpower at the end of this session. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Creighton. Nice double entendre there. Next up is Paul Vosper, and I'll share my screen to share your slide. I'll start with the first slide this time.
Well, thank you, Holly, and thank you everybody for participating today. My name is Paul Vosper. I'm the CEO of Juice Bar. We're actually the only charging company that manufactures its chargers in the US. Holly, if you can move to the next slide. So we really, from our perspective, we're a mission-based company. The primary mission is obviously, as a charging company, is to create a reliable EV charging infrastructure that will sustain future generations. And this is really one of the reasons both my business partner and I set up the company is looking at the future of this country and the future of climate in this country, and thinking about the state of the climate when our children inherit it from us. Obviously with COP26 coming out, just gone through, we are not on track yet to keep global warming down to the 1.5%. And I think I don't need to remind everybody, but the impacts of that alone are going to be severe. We're already beginning to see climate change in our own lives today. Another 1.5% will only certainly magnify that. The second part of our mission is that we believe that the green revolution, if you like, or the green infrastructure is a way to create jobs in this country. Both my partner and I belong to a group in the state of Connecticut that's looking to bring advanced manufacturing back to the state as a way to increase middle-class jobs. If you look at the people who work for us at our factory where we assemble the chargers, these are people in a relatively rural area of Connecticut that are earning a higher level of income than would be normal in that area. Full benefits, 401k plan, medical, etc. So really bringing people out of the burger flipping type jobs into real sustainable jobs, sustainable for their own personal economies. You know, I think it is there's sort of a good news and a bad news when it comes to EVs. I mean, the transportation sector accounts for about 1/3 of the carbon pollution that occurs in the U.S. In some ways, it's the low-hanging fruit in terms of being able to reduce carbon emissions. As many of you have driven an electric vehicle, the sort of light bulb moment for me was, simply put, it's a better vehicle. So it's not like we have to wear a hair shirt in the transition. It's actually a better technology all around. But it is going to require a fairly sizable rethinking of the infrastructure that we use and consume in this country. And I'll come back to that point in a little bit. But 36%, about 1/3 of the U.S. drivers will buy an EV as their next car. That's the polling data that increases if you look at purely the millennial population. And it varies state by state. So in Massachusetts, for example, that number is 50% of people will be buying or intend to buy an EV as their next car. There's this is just the automakers, but there is obviously a significant investment going into this transition, both from the automakers, the utilities, and now the federal government with the infrastructure bill. Holly, if you can move to the next slide. Primarily, this is a cost-benefit analysis. EVs are already cheaper to own. The upfront price needs to come down, but now with the new infrastructure bill, with a $7,500 incentive and a $12,500 incentive if you buy a U.S. union-made car, you start to see the prices decline. But the battery prices are really the major factor in this. A battery accounts for about 40% of the cost of the vehicle, and so battery prices are the most significant component. And if you just look at where we've been in the last, since 2010, fairly similar to what you see in the solar world. Over $1,000 a kilowatt hour back in 2010 is now $100 a kilowatt hour, and we are likely to see further decreases in the price. The $100 in 2024. Sorry about the pagination on this, but in that green box, $100 is sort of the magic number where an EV falls below the price of the equivalent gasoline engine. So that's we're only about 2 years out, and quite frankly, I think that's probably a little bit conservative. I think we're probably 12 to 18 months out from price parity. The range anxiety continues to be the single biggest impediment to EV adoption. We should be somewhere around 5 to 6 to 1 ratio, so 5 or 6 cars to every charger. We have fallen behind other countries in the world, but we need to build about 1 million chargers a year to keep pace with the EV charging. The EV vehicle purchasing. And so we have a long way to go, a long way to catch up to give people the confidence to buy an EV. I think the one thing to think about when you're dealing with EVs, it's a very different from a gas station model where you go to a specific location. And unless you're driving on the highway, the vast majority of where you charge is where you work, sleep, and play. Most people's cars are sitting for 90% of the day quiet. And so, rather than thinking about a gas station model, it's more equivalent to your cell phone, where you charging your bedside table or at work, rather than thinking about fueling stations as the preeminent. About 85% of all charging occurs in these types of locations. Only about 5% occurs on the highway. So the big level 3 fast chargers that you see on the highways represents really a tiny fraction of the overall charging environment. I think the key right now is that charging is still a fairly frictional endeavor. It's not easy to plug in. I think we as an industry have a lot to learn, particularly from the gas station industry, on how to make charging easier and more reliable. That'll be something that the industry really needs to focus on as we get into mass adoption. So, on the next slide. You can actually skip this slide, move to the next one. And then finally, I put this slide up. I think, this is a pretty good map of where the EV, the hot map of the EV world. It is primarily a bi-coastal phenomenon at this point. So the vast majority of chargers are in California. And the second area is really in the Northeast, followed by Florida and Texas. So EV adoption is not a well spread out phenomenon with a lot of work to do in the middle of the country in particular. Next slide. I think we're done on this side. So I think let's put this all into context. Why did I talk about this? And I think it's important to understand that while EV adoption or the electrification of the transportation system is imperative, and we have some good news in the sense that the numbers are increasing pretty rapidly. I think we'll see about an 85% uptick in EV sales this year. That's according to Bloomberg. But if you look even at the optimistic scenario, 50% of new car sales in 2030 are EVs, which means 50% are not. And it means that with cars on average lasting 12 years, even at 50% car sales, that's about 18 million EVs on the road by 2030. In comparison to nearly 300 million cars in total. So even under those optimistic scenarios, less than 10% of the vehicles on the road by 2030 will be EVs. So the acceleration of the EV is there. We are seeing an inflection point. Certainly, the infrastructure bill is an important component to this. But if we are really to be serious about this, we need to increase EV adoption at a far more rapid clip if we're going to start dealing with climate change. And I think as the prior speakers have mentioned, and I think Holly, you mentioned at the beginning, the automobile, our society has been really developed around the automobile, and really what the infrastructure bill and the various initiatives that the Northeast regional groups at the state and municipal level are looking at, and California is looking at too, is to start thinking about this and to reimagine infrastructure. We created in the 50s an infrastructure system that was designed around the automobile. It cut through communities, and so it's devastating to a number of communities, including in Hartford, split communities down the middle. And I think as we think, even though our company is primarily geared towards the electrification of cars, and it's an important component of that, the ability to think about a multimodal approach is going to become imperative, not only to save the climate, but also to deal with the increasing number of vehicles on the road. We're simply at this point, effectively our arterials are clogged. And this is, so as we think about infrastructure and we think about multimodal, bringing vehicles to bear as part of a solution that primarily is focused on bringing people onto public transportation or last mile transportation, and thinking about the car in a different way is going to be something that is not only is a necessity for our climate, but it's a necessity for us to be able to actually continue our economic development. As we start to clog the roads, that has a material impact. I think the other thing that we as a state need to think about, or as a region need to think about, is Connecticut was one of the first states in the world to develop manufacturing. Modern manufacturing was actually developed in Connecticut. And the ability to use this, the infrastructure bill or the budget reconciliation bill or the various state funding programs has the opportunity to bring a massive manufacturing boom back to this country. I think the supply chain issues we've all seen in the last year and a half further accelerate that. The just-in-time manufacturing model that was prevalent before COVID is now effectively a dirty word. But we do have the ability to bring back a manufacturing boom in the green economy. We have somewhere around 44,000 green jobs in the state of Connecticut alone. And that's just as we start this process. And so the promise and the ability for using infrastructure money, not only to improve how we move around, but also to improve the life of many people and to offer true middle-class jobs. As I said at the beginning, we're offering people a real income with real benefits, healthcare, 401k. For many of these people, it's the first time in their life that they've had that kind of economic security. That has an enormous impact on us as a society and us as an economic growth. So I think it's a lot of big words, but I think we are, if done right, we do have the ability to really take this opportunity to reimagine how we think about transportation and how we think about the jobs of the future. So I'll stop there, Holly.
Thank you, Paul. That's really valuable perspective, and you've set us up well to talk policy and funding with people who are in positions to do something about it. So I'd like to have Marissa speak to us next.
Yep.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Holly. And I want to thank the Transport Hartford Academy at the Center for Latino Progress for having me this afternoon. I am thrilled to be here. I really enjoy learning about this subject. And also there's at least 50 people on here and more on CTN, which means that there will be 50 more people that hopefully understand what Connecticut Pura is at the end of my speech. So as Holly mentioned at the top of the hour, my name is Marissa Gillett. I am the chair, which is another fancy word for being the commissioner of the Connecticut Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, or PURA, which is, in my opinion, one of the least understood and therefore one of the most underutilized state agencies that I think is out there. Every state has an equivalent of PURA. They're usually called public service companies or public service commissions or public utility commissions, and we go by PURA in this state. And I just wanted to start out with the brief level setting, although I'm happy to do an hour-long PURA 101 to anyone that's interested. PURA is a quasi-judicial agency, which means that we aren't like any other state agency out there. We operate much more like a court. So any ideas that are brought to us or delegated to us by the state legislature, we're responsible for investigating through what's called a docket or a case, and we can make decisions that are legally binding on the entities that we regulate. And those entities include the investor-owned utilities in the state, whether they're electric, gas, or water. So for purposes of this panel today, that I talk about what we're doing in the electric space, obviously, how it pertains to Eversource and United Illuminating. So about 2 years ago, when the governor recruited me to this state to take this position, we launched what we call the Equitable Modern Grid. There are 11 tracks targeted at modernizing the electric infrastructure in this state. And one of those tracks is focused on zero emission vehicles. Now, I have to confess, from the outset that when the governor brought me here from Maryland, my plan was initially to replicate the grid mod work that I'd done in that state. Anyone that works in multiple jurisdictions may be familiar with what's known as PC 44 in Maryland, where they stood up a zero emission vehicle framework that I led there. And we started 2 years ago by laying out objectives for this docket that largely borrowed from my experience in Maryland. And I think they were great objectives. They're the ones that were on the screen, the ones that we threw out for consideration by our stakeholders. But I think what I've learned in the last 2 years is, I took what the definition of vehicle was for granted. I assumed we were talking about cars. And since all my experience is in the electric industry and the stakeholders that usually interact with Pura are the same, time and time again, it's our utilities and, some statutory parties, including other state agencies. It wasn't until later, as we started to receive new and different perspectives into our dockets, that it even occurred to me that vehicle meant something else or could mean something else. And, I think that chart, while Tall Paul admitted it was confusing, that's something that I wasn't exposed to. So we worked through 2 years of this docket, really focused on light duty vehicles. And we have recently concluded our work in that docket. And I'm just going to spend the next couple of minutes briefly touching on it, more because I want you to know what's possible from interacting with Pura, because, to get really in the weeds in what the Pura program has authorized, we've got other materials and I'm happy to talk another time about that. So like I mentioned, we have a docket process. So if you're on the line and you're interested in interacting with Pura, I know I saw Gannon Long on there with Operation Fuel. She knows how to intervene in Pura proceedings. So I'm gonna put her out there as a champion. But we've really tried to break down the barriers to interacting with Pura. I know Paul Vosper, I believe, participated with his company in some of the early portion of our light duty vehicle fleet docket, and that resulted in some of the outcomes that we've seen in that process. So if you're interested in bringing a a micro mobility project to us, we could replicate that same process. You can come to Pura with an idea. We can help you iterate on it with our different stakeholders. Later in the process, we have to go through more formal steps, such as evidentiary proceedings before finalizing the decision. But really, that's something that we can iterate on together, and really want to focus on getting ideas in the door in these first couple of steps. So what do we do, or what did all that process result in for ZEVs? We issued a final decision this past July, so just a couple months ago, that is really intended to open up the market for light duty fleet charging, residential charging, workplace charging. It's all targeted at the light duty sector, as I mentioned. Pura's jurisdictional hook here is anything to do with the utilities or electricity. So for our purposes, that generally means focusing on rebates for the infrastructure. So whether it is, a level 2 charger or a DCFC charger, or we can also have a regulatory hook to work on rate design. So folks that are familiar with this space know what a barrier demand charges can be, especially when it comes to the DCFC side of things. So that's what Pura has the jurisdiction to do. We can play in the space in terms of the infrastructure and the rate design. So we built out a program that targets these areas with a combination of that rate design and rebates in those spaces. I'm going to put this up while I'm talking. And our jurisdictional hook here, as I mentioned, PURA is not a policy maker. We implement policy that is given to us by the legislature and the executive branch. In this case, the state has signed on to ZEV MOU goals. There's a governor's climate council on climate change, an executive order that all provides the guidance about how many EVs the state's looking to deploy by a certain time. What I can do at PURA, we are an implementing agency, which means that you can give us the inputs and we can give you an output that is focused on maximizing and getting a result that is the most cost-effective possible. Because keep in mind, our source of funding, unlike any other state agency, is ratepayers. Our programs are sourced and funded by ratepayers through electric bills. So that gives us some flexibility that other states agencies don't have, meaning that our programs don't have to go through the budgeting process. We do have the distinction of having some of the highest electricity rates in the country. But this has been a really great fun docket for me, as what I like to explain to folks is EVs and the proliferation of EVs is going to be one of the only ways that electric rates in this state go down in the near future. And that's because as the amount of sales, the amount of kilowatt hours that we deliver goes up, and the fixed costs largely stay the same, there's a higher, volume of which to spread out those fixed costs. So that's why we're really excited about playing in this space. What I'm not excited about is that we designed a program, which I learned, as proud as I am of the design of that program, I don't believe that it is accessible to everyone in the state. Not everyone can own a vehicle. I knew going in that not everyone could own a vehicle. I knew going in that some of the barriers would be you don't own your own home. Having moved to the state 2 years ago, I don't own my home. So I knew about those barriers. What I didn't know was some of the ways that micromobility can make programs like this more accessible. And we had hired the Rocky Mountain Institute to help PURA think through some of those challenges, and they held some listening sessions, which I think some of you on the line may have participated in. And we heard loud and clear that micromobility is something that we should be exploring. So what does that mean? And how can you help PURA take them the next step? Because as I mentioned, everyone's going to pay for these programs. And while I strongly believe that everyone will benefit from these programs indirectly through cleaner air and through lower electricity rates, I'm also very focused on the direct benefits and what could come of that. So the takeaway from this process overall, and what I'm hoping to inspire others to come to PURA with, either as a coalition or on your own, is we've established this process where we can help iterate on ideas that come to us. And this falls, the topic of micromobility and access to programs that are being stood up is the core of my Equitable Modern Grid initiative that PURA has launched. And I've heard about some potential solutions through the presenters before us. I've certainly benefited from speaking with many members of your community just over the past month or two. I think there are interesting and innovative ways that we could tackle this, all focused around how we could help deploy charging infrastructure or rate design that could help with, fleets and things of that nature. So having started this by saying I'm not an expert in this space, I am not a transportation planner by any means. That's why I'm so excited for the platform and the opportunity to speak with you all today. You know, just if we make just one connection here, I will walk away a happy person. And I'm going to stop there, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And I felt when we were putting this panel together that if nothing else happened out of it, that the 5 of you speakers all got to know each other, we would be successful. So we do have Senator Will Haskell here with us, and he has kindly carved some time out of his very busy schedule to as have you all, to speak with us. And I wonder do you have any slides to present, Senator Haskell, or
I don't. I'm so sorry. I was just going to deliver a few very brief remarks before we move over to audience Q&A. Is that okay with you,
Please.
Holly?
Please, absolutely.
Sure. Well, it's great to see some familiar faces on this Zoom today, and some who I don't know as well. Thanks to Holly and all the folks who brought us together. And we are just, I think, so lucky to have Chairwoman Gillett at PURA. I'm so grateful for the focus that you bring to both environmental priorities, but also bringing down the cost of energy here in Connecticut. So we're so glad you made that move from Maryland. There are two sort of elephants in the room, I think, with regard to transportation policy, these multimodal conversations, and the environmental crisis we're facing. I'll address one elephant at the start of my talk and one at the end. The first, of course, is this historic infrastructure package that obviously we've been talking about today and for the last few years. It's going to send $5.3 billion to the state of Connecticut. And I'm so thankful for our congressional delegation for getting this across the finish line. It's going to help to repair the 248 structurally deficient bridges we have, the 2,100 miles of highway that are considered to be in poor condition. But if you're a little bit like me, that's not the stuff that really excites you about the bill. What really excites me about the bill is the fact that we're going to receive $1.3 billion for public transit. And as you all know, it is a victory for the climate every single time we get somebody to abandon their internal combustion engine and instead take a bus or a train to work every day. We know that in Connecticut, 38% of carbon emissions come from the transportation sector. And while public transit isn't going to be an option for everybody, this bill also brings $53 million to our state to expand our EV charging infrastructure. And as Paul so eloquently said, we know that range anxiety is the biggest reason that folks are hesitant to once again abandon that internal combustion engine and instead get behind the wheel of a vehicle that emits zero carbon into the atmosphere. So the $53 million for EV charging infrastructure, the $1.3 billion for public transit, this is a historic moment for the state of Connecticut, and I'm incredibly excited about the upcoming legislative session. Part of the reason I was so eager to participate in this panel today, aside from the fact that I'm endlessly inspired and impressed by the co-panelists, is that I really want to hear ideas from the public about how you'd like the Transportation Committee to proceed in allocating these resources. The federal government has played a large role in sending money to the states, but it's the state legislature now that's going to establish priorities and determine which projects to accelerate. We can't possibly do that work without input from the public. I'm very grateful to represent the 26th district, 7 towns down in Fairfield County. I also serve as the co-chair of the Transportation Committee alongside Roland Lamar. We are very eager to make sure that not only is there oversight and transparency, but lots of public input as the legislature debates the very thorny topic of how these assets ought to be invested. Without a shift in priorities in Connecticut and across the country, we're never going to accomplish our goal of putting 500,000 EVs on the road by 2030. We're frankly nowhere close to meeting that expectation. And until we do a whole bunch of things, including allowing the direct sale of EVs, building out charging infrastructure, and expanding the cheaper program, we're not going to meet that lofty ambition. Of course, I should be very clear about the fact, as you all know, this package doesn't mean that we're going to be able to fund everything. It's really only an opportunity, and all those numbers that I provided were over the next 5 years. So it's not an immediate windfall, but it does present an opportunity for the legislature and the public to rework the priorities at the Department of Transportation, at DEEP, at PURA, and elsewhere. And as Paul said, it's an opportunity to create what Van Jones called green collar jobs. I've visited Juice Bar in Oxford and seen firsthand how they are creating really high paying jobs and establishing our state as a national leader. Unfortunately, Juice Bar is exporting most of the EV chargers that they make. Let's save them some shipping costs and make sure that we're installing more of their products right here in Connecticut. I also want to mention that the money that I referenced, the 1.3 billion for public transit, the 53 million for EV chargers, those are formula-based funding. But there's so much in this historic package that isn't based on formula and is instead based on competitive grants. So something that I know is near and dear to all of our hearts. I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Something that I know is near and dear to all of our hearts is school bus electrification. It is a environmental and public health injustice that kids are breathing diesel exhaust every single day on their way to and from school. We've started the process of transitioning those buses to electric vehicles, the very first one on the road in Middletown already. And by the way, as was discussed earlier, it actually saves taxpayers money in the long run. True, these buses are more expensive up front, but they have fewer vehicle maintenance costs, and obviously they save money when it comes to the gas that we no longer need to use. And then there's a whole bunch of items that aren't so sexy. Traffic signal modernization. One of the very best things you can do for the environment is alleviate traffic so that people spend less time in their car and emit fewer carbon emissions into the atmosphere. My hometown of Westport has some of the oldest traffic signals in the entire country along the Post Road. By modernizing them and making them responsive to the flow of traffic, we can actually cut traffic, make people happier, but also deliver a clear win for the next generation that so desperately is eager to meet our climate change goals. Our transit bus fleet modernization. We've got 740 transit buses out on the road, critical towards transporting our workforce to and from their jobs each and every day. We've got 330 paratransit vehicles, so critical to providing assistance for those who need an extra bit of help. Those need to be electrified as well. And that process has already started. But by the way, be on the lookout. 2 buses arrive in Stamford next month. We just placed an order for 3 more buses for Bridgeport last month. Progress is being made, but through competitive grants, we can accelerate that deployment in a way that I personally find to be really exciting. Okay, so I've been talking for too long. I really want audience input and to participate in the discussion, but let me address the other elephant in the room, which is that last week, we heard that the Transportation Climate Initiative is unlikely to come up for a vote in the legislative session. Many of you have been advocating for this for over a year. Paul, how many joint press conferences have we done to talk about how the Transportation Climate Initiative is good for jobs and good for the environment? This is crushing for environmentalists and transportation advocates across the state, because we really could use this revenue to apply for the competitive grants. Most of those competitive grants I mentioned require some level of state matching. It can be anywhere from 10% to 50% to 80% state matching. All that to say, we're going to have to get creative in the upcoming session if we're not going to create a regional plan to cap carbon emissions and ask the fossil fuel industry to contribute towards our transition to greener infrastructure. Here's the good news. We did pass in the last session the highway user fee. It asks the heaviest tractor trailers on the road to contribute to the upkeep of our infrastructure. That is estimated to bring in around $90 million a year. Let's make sure that that revenue gets spent in making Connecticut a leader, applying for these competitive funds, putting forward the matching dollars, and bringing back our fair share of federal revenue. The last thing in the world we want to see is these grant programs go to our neighboring states. Another bit of good news is that whether we like it or not, more people purchased a car during the pandemic than ever before. So our special transportation fund, which was once approaching insolvency, is having a bit of a resurgence thanks to the sales tax on motor vehicles. Let's make sure that that STF revenue is spent responsibly and with an eye towards equity, efficiency, and environmentalism. I'm so grateful to have a chance to participate in conversations like this one at this really historic and pivotal moment. I'm sorry that I didn't come with slides today, but I really have enjoyed listening to the fellow panelists and look forward to hearing from all of you about what you'd like to see the General Assembly prioritize in the next session. Thanks, Holly.
Thank you, Senator Haskell. Wow, you are you are so knowledgeable about what's going on with funding, and I really appreciate your putting the question back to us. You know, how would we like to see the funding allocated? Gannon Long asked a question in the chat about how funding is allocated sort of by mode. Is that something that you could respond to?
Sure. So I'm hardly the expert on microtransit in this room. I am really excited about a program that exists in Norwalk and Westport to help folks achieve that last mile between their workplace and the public transit options that we do have. It's called the Wheels to You program. It offers very affordable rides that ought to be electrified soon, to help folks during peak commuting hours. But obviously more needs to be done. And as you say, it's not just about vehicles. Roland Lamar, the co-chair on the Transportation Committee, has championed for years a bill that would expand the Cheaper program to apply to e-bike purchases. The Cheaper program is undersubscribed. Obviously, we want to promote EV ownership among those who can't currently afford to make that transition, but we should also encourage folks to get behind an e-bike. I had an opportunity to rent an e-bike recently, and not only is it an efficient way to get from point A to point B, it's also a ton of fun, as you guys know. The other thing I wanted to say is there is funding in this infrastructure package for trails, and we ought to take a close look at those rail lines that aren't currently being utilized, old freight lines, things of that nature. There's one that comes to mind in the Danbury area, or maybe the best example is the Norwalk River Valley Trail, which runs all the way from Danbury to the Long Island Sound. It's not yet complete. They need more funding. They're hopefully going to be cutting the ribbon on the Reading section pretty soon, but they haven't even started yet on the Ridgefield section. All that to say that infrastructure doesn't mean one thing, as you all know, and I hope that we can prioritize public transit, vehicles, biking, and pedestrian infrastructure.
Thank you. I think you missed it at the beginning, but I quoted a few different articles that were saying that 2 e-bikes are sold for every 1 e-car, one electric car currently. So that perfectly supports what you just said about expanding Cheaper. We should probably define the acronym Cheaper for anyone who doesn't know what it means.
Oh man,
it's not on the tip of my tongue. So
yeah, you put me on the spot there.
Here.
The cheaper rebate program. Anybody know what it stands for? Who isn't me? Well, it's more important is maybe, making sure folks even know about it. I get a call from constituents all the time who have no idea that there's a tax incentive or rebate program for EV ownership. Oh, thank you, Gannon. Hydrogen electric, so something or other. Anyways, it's a rebate program. We got to spread the word because it's undersubscribed.
Rebate is at the end, yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah, a rebate program for electric vehicles. Anybody else have thoughts about how to spend the funds that are coming towards us now with the infrastructure bill?
I'm a New Yorker, I shouldn't tell, right?
Well, apparently your state is doing really well at pulling in funding for EV projects. So congratulations to NYSERDA.
One thing I can say actually is that I've been to 2 fleet shows here in the city, and the move towards electrification is very, very serious on the municipal level. Multiple conversations with the folks that are doing the procurement processes, and it's going to be very interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how all of this shakes out.
And I have to say, part of the reason we're talking about multimodal transportation, electric vehicles, is because we do need to have options. That's kind of been my whole career. I've been trying to help people find more transportation options so that the price points match what people need, and they match your need based on the weather and what you're carrying today. I think someone said in the chat, could electric scooters in the future have baskets so we can carry things? We're trying to accommodate multiple needs, and that's really what we're here to talk about today. Also, with electric car share as an option, I also read a statistic recently that said that people are, I think, 40% more likely to buy an electric vehicle if they've had an opportunity to drive one, to test drive one. Creighton, you're shaking your head. Yeah, yes. So if you have electric vehicle car share in your community, you're giving people an opportunity at no risk to try out a new mode of transportation. This is also true of electric scooters and bikes that may be able to, be a solution for them, and certainly a much lower cost solution if they don't have to own the vehicle because there's a shared fleet in their community, or because, even buying one outright is so much less expensive than buying a car.
Yeah, and I just want to echo, Senator Haskell's remarks that getting creative about some of these competitive solicitations at the federal level. As I said in my remarks, there absolutely needs to be state investment in these programs, but that's not to say that our state can't get together and essentially present an alternative to continued investment in highways. So you look at some of the programs and the way they were structured with executive orders that came down from the Biden administration in January. And if you're really going to prioritize Black and brown communities, that it's going to be really tough to do that with highway expansion, right? Given just the history of this country's impacts, particularly in urban environments. So, you see some states and cities getting really creative about taking what historically was looked at as federal highway dollars and kind of flipping that script on its head. So I think just with a little bit of creative thinking, even without a state bill, we can really direct some of these resources to bike and pedestrian and equitable car share projects.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in here?
Yeah, can members of the public weigh in?
Absolutely. Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't notice your hand raised.
No worries. I'm glad to hear people are talking about flexing what are typically thought of as highway funds to other projects. The states are afforded a lot of leeway to do that and should take advantage of it. But we got to do something about these construction costs. What paid for a mile of tunnel under 2nd Avenue, $500 million, is on track to pay for a 500-foot bridge in Norwalk, carrying the New Haven line from south to East Norwalk. And at that kind of construction cost, to Gannon Long's point, rail is going to eat up all of our allocation. And you can count me as a rail fan that doesn't want to see all of that money get eaten up by rail. So we got to invest in better processes at the state DOT level so that we get these road and rail projects done for acceptable costs. Most of Connect NEC 2035 should be a single-digit billion-dollar investment.
I'm happy to chime in there, Holly, if it's okay. Thank you, Robert, for bringing up those concerns. I would say a few things. One, I share your frustration about the the timeline, the cost, just about everything about the Walk Bridge project frustrates me. Decisions were made prior to my time in the legislature there, but I think that there are some lessons learned. For those who aren't familiar with the project, this is a crucial investment in speeding up Metro North. Rather than building a fixed bridge, which would have been far less expensive, we're building a movable bridge because the waterway was not decommissioned by the U.S. Coast Guard. And unfortunately, the bridge still needs to move up and down to allow boats to pass underneath. Let's take a look at the other movable bridges that need to be replaced. There are plenty of them. Take a look at the Saga Bridge in my neck of the woods in Westport. Take a look at the Devon Bridge a little further north. Both are so old, dating back to the McKinley administration, the trains are under, I think well thought out federal regulations required to dramatically reduce their speed. When it comes time to rebuild those bridges, let's have a serious conversation about replacing them with a fixed bridge instead. I know that the Saga Bridge in Westport, that's the one with which I'm most familiar because it's close to my home, it opened 6 times last year, and 4 of those times was so that it could be tested to make sure that it still opens. I'm not at all convinced that we need a movable bridge, and building a fixed bridge would cut that cost by more than half. It would actually divide it into a third. So exploring cheaper ways to do these projects, I'm all in. But by the way, Commissioner Gillett has already said that DOT is going to need to hire about 1,000 more people unless we want to continue to contract out for services. We need talented people at the Department of Transportation. So they're getting very serious about addressing construction costs, but we can't possibly do it unless we have a really smart team in-house. And to the extent anybody on this call knows folks who ought to be applying for jobs at DOT, they're going to be going on a hiring spree quite soon. And I hope we're going to have the best and brightest within our state ranks.
A couple of things. Yeah, that's a huge factor in why our construction costs are so high. We don't have that big backbench. A couple of points on drawbridges. The Erasmus Brook spanning the Nieuwe Maas in Rotterdam has 4 highway lanes, a tram line, and a movable span, and cost $500 million a mile, about 1/9 the cost of Walk Bridge. So I'm not convinced the drawbridge feature is responsible for that kind of cost premium. And 2, we're being told by DOT that you can't have more than a 1% grade on approaches to bridges when the approaches to Penn Station have had double that for 100 years.
Thank you for that, Robert. I'm afraid we have to wrap up, and really a huge round of applause to everyone who presented today for the lively discussion. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Valerie Fernandez. I got involved in sustainable transportation and environmental justice as a transport rifle ambassador. Now I'm currently a sophomore at the Connecticut State University studying criminology and sociology to become a lawyer. I want to thank you all for attending to our summit. I am so glad that you were able to join us today in this stimulating discussion. Please let's stay in touch. You can sign up for a newsletter, you can attend to our events, and even sponsor or work for us if interested. We hope to see you around.